I'm hoping this video will be cathartic, not just for myself, but for you as well, because time and time again, I see these errors being made on designs and in particular, presentation slides. So today we're going to be using Canva. Like a good mechanic, we're going to get our hands dirty, delve in and fix a lot of these issues that are stopping your engine from running smoothly. We're going to address the top 5 biggest presentation errors that newbies make with slideshows. And the good news is these are relatively easy to fix. I'm looking forward to this one. Let's crack on. For our first big mistake, we need to address the inner child in the sweet shop. You see a huge array of pick and mix, so sweets on all the shelves, and you just want to have the lot. I'm very much like this with an all-you-can-eat buffet. At the risk of mixing metaphors, to address this, we need to pick a lane. We need to decide what's most important with our design, what the information that we need to get across, and how quickly we can get that information across. Think of a presentation slide like a billboard. Only have seconds to get that message across. So let's have a look at a broken slide and how we're going to fix it from this perspective. Okay, it took a lot out of me to create this layout, and it actually hurts now looking at it, not just my eyes, but my soul as well. This is an extreme example, and I'm sure none of you would make these mistakes at this level of degree, but it's to highlight what can go wrong. So we're going to address it one by one. So what I'm going to do is duplicate this page in Canva, and on the second slide now, we're going to start fixing it. The first point is we're going to address the child in the sweet shop approach, where we've got so many different things going on here. We just need to start by really streamlining the color palette and the font selection. So that's what we're going to do. It's absolutely fine having different fonts, but they have to be there for a reason. So the child in the sweet shop could work quite well with 2 different fonts, but then we've got a different font here again. It just doesn't have a cohesive theme carrying through it. If we're going to use a handwritten font, we'd ideally want to use the same one for here and here, but this would be better suited to be more in line with our heading. I'm going to bring this on brand, and I'm going to change it to Alice, which is our brand font to start with. I'm also going to change it to our navy, or maybe even lighter. Yeah, we might go for white text and then darken the background so that our text really jumps out against it. Okay, this then has to go. Ideally, I'd want to get rid of all that text, but that's what we're covering later on. For our brand, we use Alice as our heading font and then Arimo as our paragraph font, just because it's a little bit easier to read. When we're designing, we get carried away with new features, so the glitch effect there really doesn't work. Already, it's starting to be a little bit easier to read. If we have to keep this in, we might be better off going with a brand color background and then changing that text color to white, just so we can start to read it. I'm not addressing any of the spacing issues in this one, because we're going to cover that in the next couple of sections. So now at least we haven't got so many things fighting against each other on the screen. I'd ideally want to get rid of this background block, but we're going to have an issue at the moment with that not being legible. But that's where we're going to leave it, and we're going to move on to the next one now, which is our Spaceman. Point number 2, and the 2 following that, are going to address our Pixelhaze principles of design. And to start off with, for point number 2, we're going to be looking at Spaceman. When we refer to our Spaceman, we need to let our design breathe. In traditional terms, this is called white space. And a huge mistake that people make when they start designing presentation slides is they don't have the discipline to have white space around it. I see this in web design constantly, where someone would add their logo and make it huge in the masthead of their website, as if to say, please look at our logo, that's the most important thing. Yes, but what next? People sat watching your presentation, either in person or remotely, are not going to be overly interested in your logo. Sorry to say that, but get over it. It's about the content you're presenting based on your level of expertise on a specific subject. So the focus of that content needs to be on the subject. More on that in a bit. But in this case, we need lots of breathing space for our design. So let's go over and fix some of these problems in a live example. Okay, let's have a look at this spacing then. So the first thing I'm going to do this time is just get rid of this paragraph. We should be able to remember this and be able to explain it clearly and just have one clear message. I'm going to keep the original, and I'm going to keep this version as well. So at the end, then we can show you the progression. So if we duplicate it, now we can make sure we got the right slide, and I can just get rid of that paragraph section. And this time now, we can actually break up those lines. So the line height is way off. So if I go to this tool here and just take the line spacing right down to give it more of a compact nature, and the line height will depend, line spacing as Canva calls it, will depend on the font that you choose as well. So we can see here that there's a safety bounding box around the text. What you'll also find is the size of the font will also impact the amount of spacing you need. There we go. So we've got that. And now I'm going to increase the size of this text to give it more impact. But now we're going to address the spacing around there. With Canva, we've got smart guides. So we can see, hopefully, that pink, purple or fuchsia grid there, which goes to crosshairs in the middle. That means that these items are now centrally aligned. Now we have good spacing around our text. By getting rid of that paragraph just made it so much easier. An alternative would be probably just to bring this in from either side, if we were to go back and edit this version, just so we've got better breathing space left and right. And also I would get rid of this, the width of this bounding box overlapping the page. That doesn't really help in terms of alignment. And then we can snap that to century. So we want to make sure that there's good breathing space around our content. So if you had to leave the information in, this is what I would do. But ideally, we're looking at something as impactful as this. Still not 100% sure on this spacing between the items, but there we go. And that wasn't centrally aligned. I thought it looked a little bit off. Just change that to white as well, because we're going to change the background in the next layout. And so we've got a stronger consistency and a considerable progression. There's one thing we're going to do now additionally, and that's going to look for a icon of a suite. So I'm going to look for graphics, and I just want a plain white icon of a suite, something this shape. If I can change both of these colors to white, that will do the job for us. Going to reduce it in size, and then I might just put it inside the O, just for emphasis. There we go. We've added a little bit of an element inside there, just to add a bit more individuality to the design. Next up, we'll have a look at some consistency. For point number 3, we're going to look at how people are frustratingly, consistently inconsistent. That was a mouthful. Got through it. Be honest with yourself. You've almost certainly done this in the past. I know I have. And it's something I've had to work on to be more disciplined as a designer. Where you might have a slide title on one slide, you flick over to the next one, and it's in a completely different position. Or you might even be thinking that your font sizes are just different on slide-to-slide basis for no apparent reason. Now, having things that are inconsistent, that jump out, or maybe even chafe a little bit, is absolutely fine if that's part of the plan. You might want to go with a slide that really stands out from the rest to wake up your audience and bring them back to you. If that's the case, fine. But in most cases, these inconsistencies just radiant amateurism. So in this part, let's fix them and avoid these issues in the future. I actually fixed a lot of the inconsistencies as we've gone through, but there are a couple that are remaining. So let's duplicate this design once again. And I think we're going to look to try and get that spacing similar to the spacing in between each of the lines. And now we can select all of these and centrally align it. We could look at changing this font to match our main font, but actually that works quite well, because the reason that's inconsistent with this here is that it's meant to be more childish, more playful, and it gives a nice contrast to this text here. So that's one thing we can look at. When we're looking at consistency, we're also looking at the spacing left and right to make sure we've got equal white space left and right of our text, the same for the bottom as well. One way of doing this would be to shorten our bounding box around our text. We can do it by eye, as long as it's pretty close. You can zoom right in. We want the same space top and bottom as left and right. So that means then when we snap it to the center and that guide, we know that we've got the same space around here. So again, we can do the same thing. We can look at the space here and the space here and here to make sure we've got consistency. Spaceman focuses on making sure we've got enough breathing space so we can read the text and it's not taking over from our design, whilst consistency means that we've got the same space around the text so that it just flows in a nice consistent manner. Bringing that text in, then we snap it to the center, and now we've got some good impact there. We're looking at the spacing in between those elements. Another little trick, if you don't have guides that will help you on a certain spacing issue, is that we can use just a block, and once we've created that rectangle, we can drop it in. We can use Command or Control Plus to zoom in, and now we can just use that block there. A little trick there to make sure we've got consistent spacing. So we can then use that between there. Not bad by eye. I don't want the bottom of T to be the spacing because it will look like there's a wider spacing gap because most of the characters come in here. So that's what I'm going to use for my spacing. I can now get rid of that block, or I can use it on left and right to double check that we've got spacing either side. Now Canva didn't used to have smart guides when I started using it, and so I used to have to do this all the time to make sure we've got really good consistent spacing. Although the more time you spend as a designer, the more you get an eye for spacing anyway, and it just comes naturally. But that's a nice little trick there if you wanted to double check your spacing. We've got really good consistency in our design now. The change in font's there for a reason. The icon inside the O of Sweet Shop is there again for a reason. And that means now that when we create a different slide, we could use that different effect with a different icon in each particular one. I could talk about this topic and this would actually work for me. If we go back to the original, again, the consistency of the spacing, I would still probably reduce this so that this text would align to it. And this amount of text I'd probably align to the left. But that's more of a personal preference. The bounding box here is wider than the one on this text here. That's partly because it's centrally aligned, so I can move it to the left, but also because of the font size, it's off a little bit as well. If we use the guides alone, we can see that that heading just indents a little bit to the text. And I personally don't like that. So what I can do now is select the title and then use the cursor to just move the position manually. Okay, we've got that in place now, and then I'd be looking at the same consistent spacing left and right, and we'd probably have to either reduce the letter spacing here or the font size to get it to fit. And next up, we'll progress this design even further, and we might just add a little bit of color behind it to give it more impact. Next up, we've got Spotlight. If you're still with me for point number 4, and hopefully that's the case, then you'll find we've already fixed a number of our problems with our designs. Next up, we have our failure to shine the spotlight on what matters the most. Now, I brushed upon this very briefly earlier in this video, but now we're going to delve in a little bit more and show why the spotlight is so important. This is one of our principles of design. You've only got one star of the show. The rest is a supporting cast. So where are you going to shine your spotlight on? Let's take a look. Okay, we're going to duplicate once again. Now I want to put a bit more emphasis on the icon within the Sweet Shop. Also, we're going to go with more of a navy color in the backdrop. I've got a couple of different options here. I can reduce the transparency of the image, and that gives us the effect that we want. I can also go in and edit it and maybe just bump up the contrast. So even though it's darker, we're overemphasizing some of the colors in this. So again, we can go to saturation and increase the saturation. But now there is a clear difference between this one where the text is much harder to read and this one. But at the same time, we've still got enough impact in the background for it to tell the story. What I'm also going to do here now is maybe change the layout of this heading. So we're going to go left aligned and see how this looks. And now we're going to do the same for this. And if we look at the focus and the spotlight on some of these words, the in there is not as important. So what we can do is just reduce that font size down. I can either click down manually forever, or I can go to the drop down here and just choose a font size that works. Something like 64 will do the job. I'm going to make the line height more compact, so the line spacing, bring that down as well. And we can see here now the spacing's different because this is a larger font size. The lazy option would be to let it go, but I can't do that. So we're going to right click and duplicate, or press Command D. This time we're going to separate the characters as shown here. And now we have a better example. So we can use by eye now to use the spacing between the words. And I'm going to increase that shop lettering so Sweet Shop becomes one rectangular block. And now when I put our sweet in the middle, it's got a little bit more impact than it would have had before. The rest is just playing around with the formatting to get something that works for you. So something else we could do is actually select those layers and group them together. So our sweet stays in the center. And now make sure that this is brought to the front, and it is. So now we can select the in there. What I might look to do is just to see if I can find a sign or an arrow to add emphasis. What we're doing is we're using the arrow like a spotlight to draw focus on the wording. So with that arrow selected, we can flip it horizontally and now have the wording together like that. So there's some spacing to work on now as well. So I'm just going to do it by eye this time, and then we're going to make that arrow so it's a little bit more compact. But as we can see, the arrow and the sweet just draw focus now to that Sweet Shop wording. I can change the angle of that a little bit as well, bring them all together and centrally align them. So we could look at this and think, actually, there's a lot of space left and right. I'm not overly happy with that design, and that's fine. There is an argument for offsetting it to the left, and that's what we can also do here. where we've got the spacing top and bottom and align it to the left. And what we can do instead of darkening the background to balance this layout is we can bring it back to the fore a little bit. And this is where we can look for a gradient as our finishing touch. And we're after a linear gradient that goes to transparent. We won't worry about the color just yet. We'll change that in a minute. And we want the gradient covering behind the text. So we can right click, arrange, send backwards. We've also got the shortcut there for you as well. Sending it to the back. And that's where we can use our navy option. The one thing with gradients, if you use white as the right hand side, even though it's transparent, it would blend it in with the navy on the left. So we don't want to do that. So that's why I've gone with that option. I think we can bring this background now to full color, or at least somewhere close to it. If you remember, I overexposed the image and increased the saturation so much before. I could go back and undo those options, or I can just leave it at, say, 70-80% transparency. Now, finally, we're going to just do the same for another layer. So I've put 2 gradients on there and aligned both. I could reduce the size of this text and bring it more central, or I could leave it offset like that. But here's the progression. I know we've made a few changes from the second version of it, but this is the original. And that's a mess, really, in terms of don't know where your eye's being drawn to. There's no clear spotlight. As we move through it, this one's marginally better, but the text in the paragraph area is illegible, and also it's still a little bit messy and all over the place. This is where it really starts to take better shape. We've got the suite inside the O, which gives it a little bit more individuality as a layout, and still, though we're fighting against the background, this one tweaks the spacing to get them nice and uniform and centrally aligned, and then we change it up a little bit then with our final one, because we're drawing a focus on to the wording, but also the images to the right. Everything on this wake up our audience and give them a bit of impact, something to work with. For point number 5, we need to make sure that we're not showing the whole story. You are there to tell a story, not to show it all. If you wanted to show everything, then your audience can read a book. In this case, we need to have visual aids that perfectly marry and work alongside what we say. The lazy option, I've done this in the past myself, is to have more content on the slides to prompt you, especially if it's a presentation you haven't delivered in quite a while, or it's something that's very new to you. But wherever possible, try to really trim down the amount of content in your slides. In this example, we'll be taking a slide that has a huge amount of detail, really trimming, streamlining it down to ideally a 1-word or 1-phrase slide. Quite dramatic, but it makes such a difference in terms of the quality and the impact of our presentations. Let's take a look. So by showing the whole story, this is what I mean. Here we have a slide from our Please Don't Go to Sleep mini course. And I think I just grabbed this one off the internet. It just gives you an idea of what teachers often do because they're having to struggle around lesson plans. And there's an understanding for that in terms of sometimes you just don't have the time to really whittle the content down and show a shorter, clearer message. But if we're honest with ourselves, in most cases, we should be able to provide less information on screen. When delivering a presentation, the vast majority of the time, we know our subject matter. So if we know it, why do we need it on screen as well? In this case, this is just showing way too much, plus some other issues with this presentation. The Spaceman, the consistency is a little bit off. We've got the logo here cut off at the top of the screen, so I'm not sure whose this design was, but apologies for bringing it up. But it's a perfect example of something that's not horrendous, but at the same time, it just doesn't have the impact that we need. I love the irony of the title. That, for me, with a presentation, is not a good first impression. If we flick over to the next example, I've shown how we can trim it down a little bit and focus on just the bullet points. So if we jump back and forth between the two, we can see those bullet points. They have a paragraph alongside them. Here, we've just trimmed it down to the bullet points. We've used a background image, but again, it's a little bit sterile. There's not really the impact that we're after here, but this is absolutely fine. You can also see in the film strip along the bottom, I've shown examples of where I put too much text in, just to show that we've got this one here. I should be able to memorize those figures so we can just get rid of that and really just take our design down to that. And so that's what I do each time with the presentation. Sometimes I might want to put in the full passage, so I use the We Choose to Go to the Moon speech, and I've deliberately put the paragraph from that speech in here because we've highlighted the words that I wanted to bring to life. So those are clear reasons for having more content in our slide. This is what I'd like to do wherever possible. 1, clear message. We can go down and break down these bullet points into just one item with a strong, striking image, and the yellow really jumps out in this particular example, and that gets our message across. And the good thing is, this is actually on brand. It uses our font, it uses the navy as a font color, and also yellow is an additional brand color as well. So it ticks all the boxes, and yet it gives us far more impact. So when we're talking about showing the whole story, we want to show a perfect accompaniment to that story, not all of the wording. And hopefully you agree, just the jump in difference between this slide and this slide. Okay, we've made it. We've now addressed the 5 most common issues that people face when they're designing their own slides. These corrections will help you to create professional looking presentations, but also this can carry over into other mediums of design. To help you along, here's another video showing how you can create a professional stationery set for your business using Canva as well. And it will follow many of the same principles that we've covered in this video. Enjoy and catch you next time.
If you want to give the pro version of Canva a try, we have left a link in the description for the 30-day trial. If you are a teacher, student, or lecturer, you might be able to gain access to Canva Pro for free.